Millionaire left his girlfriend to buy milk. Years later, he saw her with 3 children. The late April sunshine streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church in Cornwall, casting rainbow-coloured patterns across Emma Bennet's wedding dress. She stood before the antique mirror in the bride's room, barely recognizing the radiant woman staring back at her. The ivory silk gown, with its intricate lace bodice and flowing train, had cost more than she'd ever dreamed of spending on a single item of clothing. But then again, she'd never dreamed of marrying someone like Alexander Blackwood, heir to one of Britain's largest real estate empires. "You look absolutely perfect," her mother Margaret whispered, adjusting the delicate veil one last time. Her eyes glistened with tears of joy, and Emma reached out to squeeze her hand, both women sharing a moment of quiet appreciation. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 11, its chimes echoing through the small room. Only an hour remained until the ceremony. Emma's stomach fluttered with a mixture of excitement and nerves as she thought about Alexander waiting at the altar, his usual confident smile warming the entire church. "Clara just texted," Sarah, Emma's maid of honor, announced, glancing at her phone. "She's with Alexander at the shops. Apparently he insisted on getting some milk for his grandmother's tea. Said he couldn't bear the thought of her having to drink it black." Sarah rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Trust your future husband to worry about tea on his wedding day." Emma laughed, the sound tinged with affection. It was so typically Alexander, always thinking of others, especially his beloved grandmother, who had raised him after his parents' tragic accident. That thoughtfulness was one of the many reasons she'd fallen in love with him, despite their vastly different backgrounds. The minutes ticked by, stretching into a half-hour, then 45 minutes. Emma's smile began to fade as she checked her phone for the 100th time. No messages from Alexander. Sarah had tried calling Clara several times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. "I'm sure they're just stuck in traffic," Margaret said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that made Emma's heart clench. At noon, when the wedding march should have been playing, Emma stood in the bride's room, still waiting. The murmur of concerned guests filtered through the heavy wooden door. Her father James entered the room, his face grave. "Emma, darling," he began, and something in his tone made her whole world tilt sideways. "Alexander's car is still at his house, but he's not there. His grandmother hasn't heard from him either." The room began to spin slightly, and Emma gripped the back of a nearby chair. Sarah immediately came to her side, wrapping an arm around her waist for support. "He wouldn't just leave," Emma whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "He loves me. We're supposed to go to the Maldives tomorrow. He's been planning this honeymoon for months." But as the afternoon wore on, and the guests slowly departed with pitying looks and awkward condolences, the truth became impossible to deny. Alexander Blackwood, the man who had swept her off her feet at a charity gala 18 months ago, who had proposed on a moonlit beach in Greece, who had promised her forever, had vanished on their wedding day. Hours later, after most of the decorations had been taken down and the caterers had packed away the untouched feast, Emma sat alone in the church garden. Her perfectly styled hair had come undone, and her mascara had left dark trails down her cheeks. She held her phone in trembling hands, reading Alexander's last text message over and over. "Just popping out for milk. Back in a few minutes, my love." The setting sun cast long shadows across the garden, and a cool breeze rustled the rose bushes. Emma shivered, pulling her mother's cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The wedding dress lay discarded in its garment bag, a beautiful reminder of shattered dreams. As she watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, Emma made a decision. She couldn't stay in Cornwall, couldn't bear the whispers and pitying glances that would follow her everywhere. London had always called to her, with its promises of anonymity and new beginnings. Perhaps there, among the millions of strangers, she could rebuild the pieces of her broken heart. She stood up, her legs shaky, but her resolve strengthening with each breath. Tomorrow she would begin packing. Tomorrow she would start planning her escape from the memories that threatened to suffocate her. Tomorrow she would take the first step toward a new life, one that didn't include Alexander Blackwood and his empty promises. What Emma didn't know, as she walked away from the garden where her dreams had withered, was that this ending was actually a beginning. And sometimes the most beautiful stories start with a broken heart. The London Underground rattled beneath Emma's feet as she stood in her tiny Notting Hill flat, unpacking the last of her boxes. 6 weeks had passed since the day that should have been her wedding, and each morning brought a little more clarity, a little more strength. The flat was nothing like the luxurious mansion she would have shared with Alexander in Cornwall, but it was hers. A third-floor walk-up with creaky floorboards and a view of a brick wall, paid for with her savings and her new job at a boutique publishing house. She placed the final book on her shelf, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that Alexander had given her on their first anniversary. She'd meant to leave it behind, but couldn't quite bring herself to do it. Some attachments, she was learning, took longer to release than others. A wave of nausea suddenly swept over her, forcing her to rush to the bathroom. It was the third time this week, and a tiny voice in her head, one she'd been desperately trying to ignore, whispered that this wasn't just stress or anxiety. "Not now," she murmured to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, noting the pallor of her skin and the slight shadows under her eyes. "Please, not now." But her body had other plans. That evening, after leaving work early due to another bout of nausea, Emma found herself sitting on the edge of her bathtub, staring at 3 pregnancy tests lined up on the counter, all positive. The room seemed to shrink around her as she processed the implications. "Miss Bennett?" Dr. Sarah Chen's voice was gentle as she studied the ultrasound screen the following afternoon. "There's something you need to see." Emma's heart stopped for a moment. "Is something wrong?" The doctor's face broke into a warm smile. "Not wrong at all. But you're not just having a baby, Miss Bennett. You're having 3. The world tilted on its axis as Dr. Chen pointed out 3 distinct heartbeats on the monitor. "Triplets," she explained, "and they all look perfectly healthy." Emma's laugh came out as something between a sob and a hiccup. "3?" she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Completely certain, Doctor," Chen confirmed, printing out the ultrasound images. "You're about 8 weeks along. Given that this is a multiple pregnancy, we'll need to monitor you closely." That evening, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, the ultrasound photos spread out before her like a hand of cards. 3 babies, 3 tiny lives growing inside her, each one carrying a piece of Alexander within them. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt an unexpected surge of determination. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was the doctor's appointment, darling? Everything okay?" Emma's fingers hovered over the keypad. How could she possibly explain this? Her parents had been devastated by Alexander's disappearance, her father even hiring a private investigator who'd turned up nothing. The official story in the papers had been that Alexander Blackwood had suffered a mental breakdown and was receiving treatment at an undisclosed location. His grandmother, the only person who might have known the truth, had refused to speak to anyone. "Everything's fine, Mum," she typed back. "Just a routine checkup." She wasn't ready to share her news yet, wasn't ready for the questions and concerns that would inevitably follow. Instead, she opened her laptop and began researching. Articles about multiple pregnancies, parenting blogs, support groups for single mothers. With each click, with each piece of information she absorbed, her fear gradually transformed into purpose. She might be alone in London, carrying 3 unexpected miracles, but she wasn't helpless. She had her education, her determination, and most importantly, she had a reason to build something extraordinary out of the ashes of her broken dreams. As night fell over London, Emma created 3 separate documents on her laptop, Baby A, Baby B, and Baby C. She began listing names, ideas, plans. The babies would need a bigger flat. She'd need to adjust her work schedule, find a reliable healthcare provider, start a savings plan. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to her unborn children, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "We don't need him. We're going to create our own kind of happiness." Outside her window, the lights of London twinkled like stars fallen to earth, each one a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there was always light to be found. Emma Bennett, the abandoned bride, was gone. In her place was a woman with a new purpose, a new direction, and 3 tiny reasons to believe in tomorrow. Spring sunshine bathed Holland Park in golden light as Emma chased after her 5-year-old triplets, their laughter echoing across the playground. Charlotte, the eldest by 2 minutes, led the charge with her wild copper curls streaming behind her. Thomas, the middle child, calculated his next move from the top of the slide. while little Sophie, the youngest, methodically constructed an elaborate sandcastle. "Mummy, watch this!" Charlotte called out, performing a wobbly cartwheel on the grass. Emma clapped enthusiastically, marveling at how her daughter had inherited Alexander's natural athleticism along with his determined spirit. "Be careful, love," she cautioned, even as pride swelled in her chest. 5 years had transformed her from a heartbroken bride into a confident single mother, her life revolving around these 3 remarkable children who had become her everything. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first year had been a blur of midnight feedings, endless diaper changes, and moments of overwhelming exhaustion. But Emma had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Her small publishing house had allowed her to work primarily from home, editing manuscripts while the triplets napped. Her parents had eventually moved to London to help, turning what could have been an impossible situation into a manageable one. "Thomas Philip Bennett, don't you dare jump from there," Emma called out, spotting her son preparing to launch himself from the highest platform. He grinned sheepishly, the expression so reminiscent of his father that it made her heart catch. All 3 children carried pieces of Alexander in their features. Thomas had his sharp green eyes, Sophie his dimpled smile, and Charlotte his determined chin. But they were uniquely their own people. "Mummy, can we have ice cream?" Sophie asked, abandoning her sandcastle to tug at Emma's sleeve. Her youngest was the dreamer of the trio, always lost in books and imagination, much like Emma herself had been at that age. "After lunch, darling. Remember, we're meeting Grandma and Grandpa at the cafe first." Emma checked her watch, noting it was nearly time for their weekly family lunch. As she gathered their things, Emma caught her reflection in a nearby window. At 32, she looked different from the woman who had once stood in a church wearing an ivory gown. Her hair was shorter now, cut into a practical bob that suited her busy lifestyle. There were tiny laugh lines around her eyes, earned from countless moments of joy with her children. She'd traded designer dresses for comfortable clothes that could withstand playground adventures and impromptu painting sessions. The local cafe where they met her parents every Sunday was just across from the park. It had become their tradition, a way to maintain family connections in their busy lives. As they walked, Emma listened to the triplets chattering about their morning adventures. "And then the butterfly landed right on my nose," Charlotte declared dramatically. "No, it didn't," Thomas countered. "It was just a leaf." "Was to a butterfly. Was not." "Sophie," Emma interrupted the budding argument, "what do you think it was?" Sophie considered the question seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I think it was fairy dust," she decided, causing both her siblings to groan. Emma smiled, remembering how she'd once dreamed of a perfect family with Alexander, 2 children, a dog, and a house in the countryside. Reality had given her something entirely different, but no less perfect. Her children were wild and wonderful, challenging and charming, exactly as they were meant to be. The cafe was busy with its usual Sunday crowd, but their regular table by the window was waiting. Emma helped the children into their seats, distributing the crayons and coloring sheets that the owner, Mrs. Peterson, always kept ready for them. "There's my favorite trio." Margaret Bennett's voice carried across the cafe as she and James entered, bearing small gift bags, their standard weekly tradition of bringing little surprises for the children. "Grandma, Grandpa," the triplets chorused, momentarily abandoning their artistic endeavors for hugs and kisses. As Emma watched her family settle into their familiar Sunday routine, she felt a deep sense of contentment. This was her life now. Messy, chaotic, exhausting, and absolutely wonderful. She'd built something real and precious from the ashes of her broken dreams, something that had nothing to do with Alexander Blackwood and his millions. But fate has a way of interrupting even the most carefully constructed piece. And across the park, unknown to Emma, a familiar figure had just stepped out of a sleek black car, his green eyes scanning the Sunday crowd with the practiced efficiency of a man used to getting what he wanted. Life, Emma would soon learn, had one more surprise in store for her carefully balanced world. Alexander Blackwood stood frozen on the path of Holland Park, his expensive Italian leather shoes rooted to the spot, as if they'd suddenly turned to lead. Through the cafe window, he could see them, 4 figures bathed in sunlight, sharing what appeared to be a typical family Sunday lunch. But there was nothing typical about the way his heart had stopped beating the moment he'd recognized Emma's profile. 5 years had changed her. Gone was the uncertain young woman who had tried to fit into his world of wealth and privilege. In her place sat someone altogether different, confident, relaxed, and surrounded by 3 small children who made his breath catch in his throat. He'd returned to London just yesterday, after years of building new developments across Asia and the Middle East. The decision to come back had been prompted by his grandmother's failing health, but he'd be lying if he denied that thoughts of Emma had influenced his choice. He'd expected to find her married, perhaps, or moved away. He hadn't expected this. The children were obviously twins. No triplets, he realized as he counted again. They appeared to be around 5 years old, their timing coinciding perfectly with... Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as the mathematics of the situation became devastatingly clear. Mr. Blackwood? His assistant James appeared at his elbow. The real estate agent is waiting at the Notting Hill property. Cancel it, Alexander said hoarsely, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene before him. One of the boys, his son, was laughing at something, his green eyes crinkling exactly the way Alexander's did. The girl with copper curls had his mother's coloring, a shade he'd passed down himself, and the quieter girl, focused intently on her drawing, held her pencil with the same precise grip he used. "Sir?" James followed his gaze, confusion evident in his tone. "Is everything all right?" Alexander barely heard him. His mind was racing back to that day 5 years ago, the day he'd convinced himself he was doing the right thing by leaving. The pressure of impending marriage, the weight of his family's expectations, the crushing fear that he would fail at fatherhood just as his own father had. It had all become too much. He'd fabricated a convenient emotional breakdown, disappeared to Hong Kong and thrown himself into work, trying to convince himself that Emma would be better off without him. But she hadn't been alone. She'd been carrying his children. The boy looked up then, his gaze passing casually over the window and the stranger standing beyond it. Alexander instinctively stepped back into the shadow of a nearby tree, his heart thundering in his chest. How many times had he seen that same expression in his own childhood photos? "James," he said quietly, "I need you to find out everything you can about them. Where they live, their routines, everything." "Sir, is that Miss Bennet?" "Yes," Alexander replied, watching as Emma helped one of the girls, his daughter, clean up a spilled drink. "And those are my children." The weight of that truth nearly brought him to his knees. He had daughters, a son, 3 innocent lives who had spent 5 years without a father because of his cowardice. The guilt was overwhelming, threatening to suffocate him where he stood. But beneath the guilt, another emotion was taking root: determination. The same drive that had helped him expand his family's business across continents now focused with laser precision on a new goal. He had to make this right, had to find a way to be part of their lives, to make up for the years he'd lost. Emma was gathering their things now, helping the children into their coats. Alexander watched as they said goodbye to an older couple he recognized as Emma's parents, noting how they moved as a unit, a family complete without him. The thought sent a sharp pain through his chest. "James," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "cancel all my appointments for the next month, and get me an appointment with Diana Mills." "The family law solicitor?" "Yes." Alexander straightened his shoulders, years of business negotiations having taught him the importance of strategy. "I need to know my rights, and then I need to find a way to approach Emma that won't make her slam the door in my face." As he watched them leave the cafe, the children skipping ahead while Emma kept a watchful eye, Alexander made a silent vow. He would not rush in with his usual bulldozer approach, wielding money and influence like weapons. These were his children, not a business deal to be won. He would do this right, no matter how long it took. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd once run away to buy milk and never returned. Now, 5 years later, he stood rooted to the spot, unable to move as his entire world shifted on its axis. Perhaps this was Karma's way of teaching him a lesson about running away from responsibilities. This time, he silently promised both himself and the family he'd just discovered he would stay and face whatever came next. For 2 weeks, Alexander watched from a distance, learning the rhythms of their lives. Every morning, Emma walked the children to St. Margaret's Primary School. always taking the same route through the park. In the afternoons, they usually spent time at the local library or the community center, where the triplets took swimming lessons on Tuesdays and art classes on Thursdays. He learned their names from his careful observation: Charlotte, the fearless leader; Thomas, the methodical thinker; and Sophie, the quiet dreamer. Each piece of information about them felt like a precious gift and a stinging rebuke. These were things he should have known from birth, moments he should have witnessed firsthand. On a crisp Wednesday afternoon, Alexander finally put his carefully constructed plan into motion. He'd chosen the small bookshop near the children's school, knowing from his observations that Emma often stopped there with the triplets after picking them up. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, right on schedule. "Mummy, can we look at the new dragon books?" Sophie's voice carried through the quiet shop. "10 minutes," Emma replied. "Then we need to head home for dinner." Alexander took a deep breath, straightened his tie, which suddenly felt too tight, and stepped out from behind the poetry section. He'd deliberately dressed down, wearing a simple blue sweater and trousers instead of his usual bespoke suits. The last thing he wanted was to remind Emma of the wealth that had once built a wall between them. Their eyes met across a display of bestsellers, and the world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Emma's face drained of color, her hand automatically reaching out to steady herself against a nearby shelf. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, keeping his distance. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no. Mummy." Charlotte appeared around the corner, holding a book about unicorns. "Can we get this one?" She stopped, looking curiously between her mother and the stranger. Emma snapped into action, her maternal instincts overriding her shock. "Charlotte, please go find your siblings. We're leaving." "But you said 10 minutes. "Now, sweetheart." Emma's voice was firm but gentle. "Please." Alexander watched as Charlotte disappeared among the shelves, calling for Thomas and Sophie. His heart ached at the lost opportunity to properly meet his daughter, but he knew he had to handle this carefully. "What are you doing here?" Emma demanded, her initial shock giving way to anger. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady. "I saw you at the cafe 2 weeks ago," he admitted. "With the children." "Our children." Emma's eyes flashed. "They're my children, Alexander. You lost any right to call them yours when you went out for milk and never came back." The bitterness in her voice made him wince. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I have no right to be here, no right to ask anything of you. But Emma, please, they're my flesh and blood. I just want a chance to—" "To what?" she interrupted. "To disappear again when things get difficult? To break their hearts like you broke mine?" The triplets reappeared then, all three looking curiously at the adults. Thomas, in particular, was studying Alexander with an intensity that reminded him painfully of his own father. "Time to go," Emma said brightly, though Alexander could hear the strain in her voice. "Say goodbye to Mrs. Jenkins," she called to the shop owner, who had been watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed interest. "Emma, wait." Alexander stepped forward, then stopped as she flinched. "Please, can we talk? Just talk. I'll meet you anywhere you choose, anytime. I need to explain." She gathered the children closer, creating a physical barrier between them and him. "I'm not interested in your explanations, Alexander. I stopped being interested 5 years ago." "Then why did you keep my grandmother's weekly letters?" he asked quietly. Emma froze, her face paling further. "How did you—" "She told me yesterday. She also told me how you never replied, but you never returned them either." He took a careful step closer. "She's not well, Emma. She'd like to meet them, her great-grandchildren, before—" "That's not fair," Emma whispered, and he could see tears gathering in her eyes. "Using her like that isn't fair." "Mummy?" Sophie tugged at Emma's sleeve. "Are you sad?" Emma quickly wiped her eyes, forcing a smile. "No, darling, Mummy's fine." She pulled out her phone and pressed a few buttons. "I'm calling us a cab. We're not walking home today." Alexander watched helplessly as she ushered the children toward the door. But just before she left, she turned back to him. "Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, the cafe where you saw us. Don't be late and don't you dare bring your lawyers." Then she was gone, leaving Alexander standing in the middle of the bookshop, his heart racing with equal measures of hope and fear. It was more than he'd dared to hope for, but he knew tomorrow's conversation would determine everything that came after. He had one chance to explain himself, one chance to begin making things right. And this time, running away wasn't an option. The cafe seemed smaller somehow as Emma waited, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, partly to choose a table near the exit, partly to gather her thoughts. Her parents had the children for the afternoon, thinking she had a work meeting. The lie sat uncomfortably in her stomach, but she wasn't ready to explain Alexander's reappearance to anyone, not even them. At precisely 4 o'clock, Alexander walked through the door. He was more casually dressed than she'd ever seen him, in dark jeans and a grey cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Some things, it seemed, hadn't changed. "You came," he said softly, sliding into the seat across from her. "You're still punctual," she replied, her voice carefully neutral, "at least for some appointments." He accepted the jab with a slight wince. "Emma, No," she cut him off, raising a hand. "Before you start, I need to set some ground rules. First, this conversation isn't about us. It's about the children. Second, I don't want your money. We've managed perfectly well without it for 5 years. And third, if you're planning to disappear again, walk away now, because I won't let you hurt them like you hurt me." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "You've changed," he finally said. "Raising 3 children alone will do that to you." The waitress approached their table, and Alexander ordered a black coffee. Emma noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the sugar packet, a tell she remembered from their days together, a sign that he was more nervous than he wanted to appear. "I saw a therapist," he said abruptly, once the waitress had gone. "In Hong Kong." "For 3 years." Emma blinked, surprised by this admission. The Alexander she'd known would never have admitted to needing help. "My father," he continued, his voice low, "wasn't just a distant parent. He was cruel, not physically, but emotionally. Nothing was ever good enough, no achievement ever worthy of praise. When he and my mother had their accident, I was relieved. What kind of son feels relief when his parents die? Alexander, please let me finish." He took a shaky breath. "The day of our wedding, I looked in the mirror and saw him staring back at me. All I could think was that I would become him, that I would hurt you, hurt our children the way he hurt me. The panic was overwhelming. I convinced myself that leaving was the kindest thing I could do." "So you ran away to Hong Kong," Emma said flatly. "I ran away from myself," he corrected, "from who I was afraid of becoming. The therapist helped me understand that by running, I'd actually become exactly what I feared. Someone who abandoned their family." Emma's hands tightened around her cup. "Did you know about the pregnancy?" "No," he whispered, and the pain in his voice seemed genuine. "Not until I saw you in the park 2 weeks ago." "Emma, if I'd known." "You would have what?" she challenged. "Sent money? Hired nannies? Tried to buy your way out of responsibility like you do with everything else?" His face flushed. "I deserve that. I deserve all of it. But Emma, they're my children too. I want to know them, not as a wallet or a distant figure, but as a father, a real one." "They're happy," Emma said firmly. "They're well-adjusted, they're loved, they're thriving. Why should I risk that by letting you into their lives? Because they deserve to know where they come from. Because Sophie has my mother's artistic talent, Thomas has my grandfather's analytical mind, and Charlotte has my grandmother's spirit. Because they're 5 years old, and someday they're going to start asking questions about their father." Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them away angrily. "And what am I supposed to tell them? That their father thought buying milk was more important than their wedding day?" "Tell them the truth," Alexander said quietly. "That their father was a coward who ran away from happiness because he was too afraid to deserve it. Tell them he spent 5 years in therapy learning how to be brave enough to come back." The raw honesty in his voice made Emma's carefully constructed walls waver. She remembered the Alexander she'd fallen in love with, not the polished businessman, but the man who'd once spent hours helping her build a bookshelf, who'd read poetry to her on rainy Sunday mornings, who'd looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had. "Your grandmother," she said finally. "How is she really?" "Not good. 6 months, maybe less. She asks about them every day." Emma closed her eyes, remembering the weekly letters she'd never had the courage to open, but couldn't bear to throw away. "I'll think about it," she said at last. "But if, and it's a big if, I agree to let you meet them, it happens on my terms, no lawyers, no custody battles, no throwing your money and influence around." "Anything," he agreed quickly. Whatever you decide. She stood up, gathering her coat. I'll call you. The number's still the same? He nodded, hope flickering in his eyes. Emma, he called as she turned to leave. Thank you. For raising them to be so beautiful. For doing what I couldn't. She paused at the door, not turning back. I didn't do it for you, Alexander. I did it for them. As she stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine, Emma felt the weight of the past 5 years pressing down on her shoulders. She had decisions to make, ones that would affect not just her life, but the lives of 3 innocent children who had never asked to be part of this complicated story. For the first time in 5 years, she wished she had someone to share the burden with. Emma spent the next week watching her children with new eyes, searching for signs of Alexander in their every gesture. How had she never noticed that Thomas held his fork exactly like his father, or that Sophie's contemplative frown was a mirror image of Alexander's? The knowledge felt like a stone in her pocket, constantly present, impossibly heavy. Mummy, who was that man in the bookshop? Charlotte asked one evening as Emma tucked her into bed. The question she'd been dreading had finally arrived, wrapped in innocent curiosity. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her heart hammering. What made you think of him, sweetheart? Charlotte shrugged, hugging her stuffed unicorn closer. You looked at him like you knew him, and he looked at us funny, like Mrs. Peterson does when she's trying not to cry at sad films. From the next bed, Sophie stirred. I thought he looked nice, she offered sleepily. Like the princes in my storybooks. Thomas, who was supposed to be asleep in his own room but had sneaked in to join his sisters as he often did, spoke up from his spot on the floor. He had eyes like mine. Green ones. Emma felt the walls closing in. She'd spent 5 years protecting them, building a safe and happy world where they never had to feel the ache of abandonment. But now, watching their curious faces in the soft glow of the nightlight, she realized she might have been protecting herself just as much. Darlings, she began, then paused to gather her courage. What would you think about meeting a new friend? Someone who knew Mummy a long time ago. Is it the man from the bookshop? Charlotte asked immediately, sitting up straighter. Yes, Emma admitted. His name is Alexander, and he's someone very special. Special how? Thomas demanded, his analytical mind already working through the puzzle. Emma took a deep breath. He's your father. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's eyes went wide, Charlotte's mouth dropped open, and Thomas scrambled to his feet, his face a storm of emotions. But you said our daddy had to go away, Sophie whispered. I know, darling, and he did. But now he's come back and he'd very much like to meet you properly, only if you want to, of course, Emma added quickly, watching their reactions carefully. Why did he go away? Thomas asked, his voice small but steady. Emma's heart cracked a little. How could she explain adult fears and failures to these innocent hearts? Sometimes, she said carefully, grown-ups make mistakes because they're scared. Your father, he was very scared of not being good enough. That's silly, Charlotte declared with 5-year-old certainty. Being a daddy isn't about being good enough. It's about reading stories and giving hugs and playing football in the park. Emma smiled through her tears. You're right, love. Sometimes grown-ups need to learn what children already know. Does he want to be our daddy now? Sophie asked, clutching her favorite book, the one about a lost penguin finding its way home. He'd like to try, Emma answered honestly, but only if you want him to. And not all at once. We'd start small, maybe meeting him in the park or at the cafe where we have lunch with Grandma and Grandpa. Thomas crawled onto the bed next to her, his small hand finding hers. Will you be sad if we meet him? The question knocked the breath from her lungs. No, darling, she managed. I want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. Can we think about it? Charlotte asked, showing a maturity that made Emma's heart swell with pride. Of course you can. There's no rush. We can talk about it more tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever you're ready. She tucked them in again, kissing each forehead and whispering, I love you 3 times. As she turned off the light, Sophie's voice drifted through the darkness. Mummy, can you leave the door open a little bit more tonight? Emma obliged, understanding the need for extra light on a night when the world had suddenly become bigger and more complicated. She made her way to the kitchen, hands shaking as she reached for her phone. They know, she texted Alexander. They're processing. Give them time. His reply came almost instantly. Thank you for telling them. I'll wait as long as they need. Emma sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of their family life. Artwork on the fridge, a calendar full of school activities, 3 different colored lunchboxes lined up for tomorrow. She'd built this life carefully, brick by brick, filling it with love and laughter, and the kind of security she'd never had growing up. Now she had to trust that foundation was strong enough to withstand this earthquake of change. Because somewhere between the bookshop and tonight, she'd realized that protecting her children meant giving them the chance to know all parts of themselves, even the parts that came from Alexander. Holland Park looked different on this Saturday morning, though nothing had physically changed. Emma sat on their usual bench, watching the triplets play on the nearby climbing frame while they waited for Alexander. They'd chosen this spot carefully, familiar territory for the children, open enough to feel safe, casual enough to ease the pressure of this momentous meeting. "Remember," she told them over breakfast, "if at any time you feel uncomfortable or want to leave, just say the word." There's no pressure. Now watching them play, she could see their nervous energy in every movement. Charlotte was more boisterous than usual, Thomas more withdrawn, and Sophie kept glancing at the park entrance every few minutes. At exactly 10 o'clock, Alexander appeared on the path. He carried 3 identical gift bags, which made Emma's heart sink, until she noticed they were from the local bookshop, not some expensive boutique. He'd remembered their love of books. He'd been paying attention. "Is that him?" Sophie whispered, suddenly appearing at Emma's side. "Yes, darling. Would you like to stay here with me while he comes over?" Sophie nodded, pressing close to her mother's side. Charlotte and Thomas abandoned their play to join them, forming a protective cluster around the bench. Alexander approached slowly, as if afraid of startling them. He'd dressed casually again. Jeans, a simple button-down shirt, trainers instead of his usual leather shoes. The effort to appear approachable was obvious. "Hello," he said softly when he reached them, his eyes moving from one small face to another with barely concealed wonder. "Hello," Charlotte replied first, bold as always. "I'm Charlotte. That's Thomas, and that's Sophie, but you probably already knew that." A smile touched Alexander's lips. "I did. Your mother told me. Thank you for agreeing to meet me today." "Mummy said you're our father," Thomas stated, his green eyes, so like Alexander's, studying the man intently. "I am." Alexander knelt down to their level, though he maintained a respectful distance. "And I know I have a lot to make up for." "Did you really go away because you were scared?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma watched Alexander's face crumple slightly at the question. "Yes," he admitted. "I was very scared and very foolish. Instead of being brave and staying to be your father, I ran away. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Bigger than the time Thomas tried to teach our goldfish to swim better, and it jumped out of the bowl," Charlotte asked seriously. The tension broke as both adults couldn't help but laugh. "Much bigger," Alexander assured her, "though that does sound like quite a story." "He was just trying to help," Sophie defended her brother, "and we got a new goldfish." "Speaking of stories," Alexander said, gesturing to the bags he carried, "I brought something for each of you, if that's all right." He glanced at Emma for permission. She nodded slightly, touched that he'd asked. The books had been thoughtfully chosen, a collection of dragon tales for Sophie, an illustrated book about space exploration for Thomas, and a volume of world mythology for Charlotte. Each child accepted their gift with varying degrees of shyness and excitement. "How did you know I liked dragons?" Sophie asked, already flipping through the pages. "Your mother mentioned you were looking at dragon books in the shop when we first saw each other," Alexander explained. "And I used to love dragons too, when I was your age." "Really?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "What was your favorite kind?" "Welsh green dragons," Alexander replied without hesitation. "They were supposed to be the most musical of all dragons. I like Chinese dragons better," Sophie declared. "They're wise and bring good luck." And just like that, the ice began to thaw. For the next hour, they talked about dragons and space stations and Greek myths. The children gradually moved from the bench to the grass, sitting in a loose circle with Alexander, as they showed him their favorite parts of their new books. Emma watched, her heart performing complicated acrobatics in her chest. She saw how Alexander never pushed, never demanded attention, but let each child approach him in their own way. Charlotte with her rapid-fire questions, Thomas with his careful observations, and Sophie with her shy smiles and whispered comments. "Would it be all right if we did this again?" Alexander asked as their time drew to a close. "Perhaps next weekend?" The children looked to Emma, who nodded. Same time, same place. Can we feed the ducks next time? Sophie asked suddenly. There are baby ones now. Of course, Alexander agreed quickly. I'll bring proper duck food, not bread. Did you know bread isn't actually good for ducks? We know, Thomas said. The park ranger told us. They like frozen peas better. And corn, Charlotte added. And seeds. As they gathered their things to leave, Sophie suddenly stepped forward and handed Alexander her dragon book. You can borrow it, she said solemnly, to read about the Chinese dragons, but I want it back next time. Emma saw Alexander's hands tremble as he accepted the book. I'll take very good care of it, he promised. Thank you, Sophie. Walking home later, Emma listened to the children chatter about their morning. The anxiety that had knotted her stomach for days began to loosen slightly. They were resilient, these children she'd raised, strong enough to handle this new challenge, wise enough to protect their hearts while still leaving room for hope. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. Thank you. They're incredible. You've done an amazing job. For the first time in 5 years, Emma found herself typing back not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. They really are. Same time next week. Don't be late. Because sometimes, she was learning, the bravest thing you can do is give someone else a chance to be brave too. Over the next 6 weeks, Saturday mornings became sacred territory. Alexander arrived promptly at 10, always bearing thoughtful little gifts. Not expensive toys, but items that showed he was paying attention. Special seeds for the ducks, a magnifying glass for Thomas after he expressed interest in examining leaves, colored pencils for Sophie's drawings, and a jump rope for Charlotte when she mentioned wanting to learn. The park meetings expanded into other carefully planned activities. A visit to the Natural History Museum, where Thomas spent 2 hours asking Alexander questions about every exhibit. An afternoon at the local community center's art class, where Sophie shyly showed him her watercolor techniques. A Saturday at the Children's Theatre Workshop, where Charlotte proudly performed her part as a talking tree. Emma watched it all with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. Alexander was proving to be patient, attentive, and surprisingly good with children, everything she'd once believed he could be, before that fateful wedding day. Mummy, Thomas asked one evening as she helped him with his homework, why doesn't Alexander come to our house? Jason's dad comes to his house all the time. The question made Emma pause. They'd kept the meetings to public spaces, neutral territory where everyone felt safe. But she could see in Thomas's eyes that he was ready for more. Would you like him to come here sometimes? She asked carefully. Thomas nodded. He promised to help me build my new space station model, and Sophie wants to show him her dragon collection, and Charlotte says he needs to see her trophy from football. That night, after the children were asleep, Emma sent Alexander a text. They're asking about having you visit the house. Sunday lunch next week? His reply was immediate. I'd be honored. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, and maybe some milk, she added, surprising herself with the attempt at humor. The following Sunday, Alexander arrived at their modest flat carrying a bag of groceries. I thought we could cook together, he explained. If that's okay? The children swarmed around him, eager to show him their rooms, their toys, their world. Emma watched as Alexander took it all in, the crayon drawings on the walls, the mismatched furniture, the obvious signs of a home built on love rather than luxury. And this is where we have breakfast, Charlotte was saying, leading him through their small kitchen. Mummy makes heart-shaped pancakes on birthdays. Speaking of cooking, Alexander said, unpacking the groceries, who wants to help make lunch? Soon the kitchen was filled with chaos as Alexander taught the triplets how to make homemade pasta. Flour dusted every surface, including their faces, and the laughter was constant. Emma found herself joining in, showing them how to knead the dough properly, pretending not to notice when Thomas sneaked a taste of the sauce. You're different here, she observed quietly while the children set the table. Alexander looked up from where he was straining the pasta. What do you mean? More relaxed, more real. He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. In the park, at the museums, I always felt like I was auditioning for the role of father. Here in their space, seeing how they live, it feels more natural, like I can finally see the whole picture. The lunch was noisy and messy and perfect. Sophie insisted on sitting next to Alexander to show him her latest dragon drawings. Thomas peppered him with questions about the physics of pasta making. Charlotte regaled them with stories from her football matches. "Can Alexander come for Sunday lunch every week?" Sophie asked as they cleared the plates. Emma met Alexander's hopeful gaze across the table. "We'll see," she said carefully. "But maybe next Sunday he could come help paint your bedroom like you've been asking." The children's excited cheers drowned out any response Alexander might have made, but his grateful smile said enough. Later, as he prepared to leave, Alexander lingered in the hallway, looking at the height marks penciled on the wall, 5 years of growth carefully documented. "I missed so much," he said softly. "You're here now," Emma replied, surprising herself with the lack of bitterness in her voice. "Emma," he turned to face her, his expression serious. "I know we agreed no lawyers, no custody battles, but I'd like to make things official. Child support, visitation rights, everything properly documented. Not to take them away from you, but to make sure they know I'm committed, that I'm not going anywhere this time." She studied his face, remembering how she'd once been able to read every emotion there. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "This isn't just about legal documents, it's about trust." He nodded, accepting her answer without pushing. Another change from the Alexander she'd known before. As she closed the door behind him, Emma heard the children in the living room, already planning what colors they wanted for their bedroom walls. Their voices were full of excitement, hope, and the kind of simple trust that only children could maintain. She leaned against the door, closing her eyes. The flat smelled of pasta sauce and happiness, of new beginnings and old wounds healing. Maybe, she thought, trust wasn't something you waited to feel. Maybe it was something you built, one Sunday lunch at a time. The Blackwood family estate stood exactly as Emma remembered it, a graceful Georgian mansion set among perfectly manicured gardens. But today, approaching it with 3 curious 5-year-olds, it seemed less intimidating than it had in her younger days. "It's like a castle," Sophie gasped, clutching her favorite stuffed dragon closer. "It's where I grew up," Alexander explained, helping them out of the car. "And where your great-grandmother has lived her whole life." Emma watched as the children took in the grand house, each reacting in their characteristic way. Charlotte was already racing toward the fountain in the center of the circular drive, while Thomas studied the architecture with serious concentration. Sophie stayed close to Emma's side, overwhelmed by the grandeur. "Remember what we talked about," Emma said gently. "Great-Grandma Victoria isn't feeling very well, so we need to be calm and quiet when we visit her." They'd spent the past week preparing the children for this visit, explaining about their great-grandmother's illness in terms they could understand. Alexander had shown them photos, told them stories, and answered their questions with remarkable patience. The housekeeper, Mrs. Harrison, met them at the door. Her eyes widened at the sight of the triplets, and Emma saw her discreetly wipe away a tear before leading them upstairs. Victoria Blackwood's bedroom was bright with morning sunshine, fresh flowers adorning every surface. The elegant woman, propped up against silk pillows, bore little resemblance to the formidable figure Emma remembered, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "So," she said softly as the children entered, "you've finally come to meet your old great-grandmother." The triplets hung back initially, but Victoria had clearly prepared for this moment. On a small table beside her bed sat 3 distinctive music boxes. "Alexander tells me you each have your own special interests," she said, her voice weak but warm. "Charlotte, this one plays a warrior's march. It belonged to my grandmother, who was quite the adventurer herself." Charlotte stepped forward, drawn by the ornate silver box. When she opened it, a stirring melody filled the room, and Victoria smiled at her obvious delight. "Thomas, this one is rather special. It's actually a puzzle box. You have to figure out how to open it before you can hear the music." Thomas's eyes lit up at the challenge, and he accepted the wooden box with reverent hands. "And Sophie," Victoria's voice softened further, "this one tells a story. See the dragons carved on the sides? When you open it, they seem to dance to the music." Soon all 3 children were settled around Victoria's bed, entranced by their gifts and the stories that came with them. Emma watched as the elderly woman pointed out details on each box, sharing tales of their history that had the children hanging on every word. "You know," Victoria said after a while, "I've written letters to you every week since you were born." "The ones Mummy keeps in the special box?" Sophie asked innocently. Emma felt her cheeks flush as Alexander turned to look at her questioningly. She'd never told him she'd kept all the letters, stored carefully in a carved wooden box under her bed. "Yes, exactly those," Victoria smiled. "Would you like me to read you some of them?" For the next hour, Victoria shared selected passages from her letters, stories about Alexander's childhood, family history, and her hopes for the great-grandchildren she'd never met. The children listened, fascinated to hear about their father as a little boy, especially the story of how he once tried to turn the fountain into a swimming pool for his pet ducks. "You had ducks?" Charlotte asked Alexander, delighted. "3 of them," he admitted, though they weren't supposed to live in the fountain. As the morning wore on, Emma noticed Victoria's energy fading, though she tried to hide it. The children, however, seemed to sense it instinctively. Sophie climbed carefully onto the bed and showed Victoria her dragon drawings. Thomas demonstrated how he'd solved the puzzle box. Charlotte performed a small dance to her music box's melody. "You've done a wonderful job with them, Emma," Victoria said quietly, while the children were distracted by Alexander showing them old family photos. "I see so much of their father in them, but they have your strength." Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I kept all your letters," she admitted. "I just couldn't open them." "But you didn't throw them away." Victoria reached for her hand. "You kept the door open, even just a crack. That's what matters." Before they left, Victoria asked for a moment alone with the children. Emma and Alexander waited in the hallway, neither speaking but both understanding the importance of this private moment. When they emerged, each child was carrying a small velvet pouch in addition to their music boxes. Sophie's eyes were wet with tears, but she was smiling. "Great-Grandma Victoria said these are our special secrets," Charlotte announced, clutching her pouch. "We're not supposed to open them until Christmas." In the car driving home, the children chattered excitedly about their visit, their music boxes, and their mysterious gifts. Emma noticed Alexander wiping his eyes more than once, though he tried to hide it. "She's really sick, isn't she?" Thomas asked suddenly, his perceptive nature showing through. Alexander took a deep breath. "Yes, she is. But she's very happy she got to meet you all." "Can we visit her again?" Sophie asked. "Of course," Emma found herself saying, meeting Alexander's grateful look in the rearview mirror, "as often as she feels up to it." That evening, after the children were asleep, Emma finally opened the wooden box under her bed. 5 years of letters, each one filled with stories, hopes and love for 3 children their writer had never met. As she read through them, she realized that while she'd been building a wall to protect her children, Victoria had been building a bridge, one letter at a time. She texted Alexander, "Thank you for today, it meant everything to her." "And to them." His reply came moments later. "Thank you for keeping those letters, for keeping hope alive even when I didn't deserve it." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Emma thought about legacies, not of wealth or property, but of love, stories, and music boxes that held more than just melodies. Sometimes she realized the greatest inheritance wasn't what was written in legal documents, but what was written in hearts. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, just as Emma was preparing to leave work to pick up the children from school. Alexander's face flashed on her phone screen, unusual for their typically text-based communication. "Emma," his voice was tight with tension, "there's an emergency board meeting in Dubai. The lawyers say if I don't go, we could lose the entire Middle Eastern division." She felt her stomach drop. This Saturday was the triplets' first school play. They'd been practicing for weeks, Sophie as a star, Charlotte as the moon, and Thomas as a wise owl. Alexander had been helping them rehearse their lines every Sunday. "When do you leave?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "The jet is waiting. I'll be gone through the weekend." He paused. "I'll make it up to them. I'll arrange a private performance, hire a proper theatre." "Don't you dare!" Emma cut him off. "They're 5 years old, Alexander. They don't need a private theatre. They need their father in the audience of their school hall, sitting on an uncomfortable plastic chair like every other parent." Silence filled the line. Emma could almost hear him thinking, calculating losses and gains like the businessman he'd been trained to be. "The Dubai deal is worth millions," he said finally. "And what's their trust worth?" Emma countered. "What's your word worth?" More silence, then, "I'll call you back." Emma spent the drive to school fighting back memories of another time Alexander had chosen his business over family commitments. But this was different, she reminded herself. He'd changed, hadn't he? The children were bubbling with excitement when she picked them up. Charlotte demonstrating her moon dance for the 100th time, Thomas reciting his owl wisdom, Sophie practicing her twinkles. "Is Alexander coming to Sunday lunch?" Sophie asked as they walked home. "I want to show him my star costume." Emma's heart clenched. "We'll see, darling. He's very busy with work right now." That evening, as she helped the children with their homework, her phone buzzed again. "Put me on speaker," Alexander said when she answered. The children gathered around the phone, eager to hear his voice. "I need to tell you something important," Alexander began. "There's a very big meeting happening in Dubai this weekend." Emma watched the children's faces fall, saw Thomas's lower lip tremble slightly. "But," Alexander continued, "I've just spent 4 hours reorganizing everything because there's an even more important meeting happening at your school on Saturday. One where a very special star, moon and owl are performing." The children's squeals of delight nearly drowned out his next words. "I had to move some things around, and some people are very angry with me right now. But I made a promise to be there, and promises to family come first. Always." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Emma texted him. "How bad is the fallout? Lost the Dubai deal. Board is furious. Grandmother says it's the first sensible decision I've made in years." Emma stared at the message, understanding the magnitude of what he'd chosen. The old Alexander would never have sacrificed business for anything. Saturday morning found them all at the school hall, Alexander included, watching 3 nervous 5-year-olds prepare for their stage debut. He sat between Emma and his grandmother, who had insisted on coming despite her weakness. The play was everything a primary school production should be, endearingly chaotic with forgotten lines, dropped props, and moments of unexpected brilliance. Sophie's star surprisingly had the steadiest performance, while Charlotte's moon dance incorporated some impromptu breakdancing moves. Thomas delivered his owl wisdom with such scholarly gravity that several parents chuckled. Alexander recorded every moment, his hands shaking slightly with emotion. When Sophie spotted him in the audience and gave an extra bright twinkle, Emma saw tears in his eyes. During the reception afterward, while the children were enjoying celebratory cupcakes with their classmates, Alexander's phone kept buzzing with messages from angry board members and shareholders. "Aren't you going to answer those?" Emma asked. He shook his head, watching as Charlotte demonstrated her moon dance for an admiring group of parents. "They can wait. This can't." "You really have changed," she said softly. "I had to," he replied, his eyes never leaving the children. 5 years ago, I ran away because I was afraid of becoming my father. Today I walked away from millions because I was more afraid of becoming the man I used to be." Victoria, sitting nearby in her wheelchair, reached out to pat his hand. "Your father measured success in pounds and pence," she said. "But there are some things money can't buy, like the look on Sophie's face when she saw you in the audience." That evening, Alexander joined them for an impromptu celebration dinner of pizza and ice cream. The children performed an encore of their roles in the living room, with added sound effects and increasingly creative interpretations of their original parts. As he prepared to leave, Sophie hugged him tightly. "Thank you for coming to my play," she whispered. "I was worried you might be too busy, like Jason's daddy, who's always too busy." Alexander knelt down to her level. "I will never be too busy for you, or for Thomas, or for Charlotte. Sometimes I might have to work hard to keep that promise, but I will always keep it. Always." Emma watched from the doorway as he hugged each child goodnight. The businessman who had once fled from responsibility had been replaced by a father who would sacrifice everything to keep a promise to his children. Sometimes, she realized, people really did change. And sometimes, the greatest proof of change wasn't in grand gestures, but in simple choices, like sitting on an uncomfortable plastic chair in a school hall on a Saturday morning, watching your children shine. 1 year to the day after Alexander had first spotted Emma and the children in the park, the newly formed family gathered in Victoria Blackwood's garden. The spring air was thick with the scent of roses, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the carefully tended lawns. Victoria sat in her favorite chair on the terrace, wrapped in blankets despite the warm day, watching as her great-grandchildren played an elaborate game of their own invention. Something that seemed to involve dragons, space exploration, and interpretive dance. A perfect blend of each child's passions. "You've done well," she said to Emma and Alexander, who sat nearby at the garden table, reviewing paperwork spread out before them. "All of you. The papers were the final versions of their custody agreement, worked out over months of careful discussion and compromise. No lawyers had been needed in the end, just two adults putting their children's needs first. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked Emma, gesturing to the document that would make their arrangement official. "Joint custody, shared decisions, equal time?" Emma watched as Thomas explained something scientific to his sisters, using the same hand gestures Alexander did when he was making an important point. "They need both of us," she said simply. "Different houses, different rules sometimes, but always both of us." The past year had been a journey of careful steps and gradual trust building. Alexander had proven himself not just with grand gestures like the school play, but with consistent presence in the small moments: homework help, football practice, dragon drawing sessions, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. "Daddy," Sophie called out suddenly, "can you show Charlotte and Thomas how to do the dragon dance again? They're doing it all wrong." Alexander grinned, setting down his pen. The title of Daddy was still relatively new. They'd made the transition 6 months ago, after much discussion and preparation. Now it fell from the children's lips as naturally as breathing. "Coming, sweetheart. But remember, there's no wrong way to dance like a dragon." Emma watched as he joined their game, his expensive suit getting grass-stained as he demonstrated the proper technique for dragon-inspired interpretive dance. The sight would have been unimaginable a year ago. "He's not the same man who left you," Victoria observed quietly. "No," Emma agreed. "And I'm not the same woman he left." Victoria reached for her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "My dear, that's exactly why it works now. You both had to become different people to be the parents these children needed." The children's game had evolved to include both parents now, with Charlotte directing everyone in what she called a cosmic dragon ballet. Emma found herself playing the part of a constellation, while Alexander portrayed a space-traveling dragon king. Later, as they shared a picnic lunch on the lawn, Thomas asked the question they'd been expecting. "Are you and Daddy going to get married again?" Emma and Alexander exchanged a look. They'd discussed this, knowing the children would eventually wonder. "No, darling," Emma answered honestly. "Daddy and I care about each other very much, but in a different way now. We're a family because we're your parents, and that's the most important thing." "Like Jason's mum and dad?" Charlotte asked. "They live in different houses, but they're still a family." "Exactly like that," Alexander confirmed. "Sometimes the best families are the ones that look a little different from what people expect." Sophie considered this, absently petting the little rescue dog they'd adopted 3 months ago, a joint decision that had helped cement their new family dynamic. "I think I like our family just how it is," she decided. Victoria's nurse appeared then, signaling it was time for her rest. The children rushed to hug their great-grandmother goodbye, careful not to squeeze too hard. "Remember," Victoria whispered to each of them, "your music boxes have more secrets to share when you're older. Keep them safe." As they helped her inside, Emma noticed Alexander wiping away tears. Victoria's health was declining rapidly now, but she'd held on long enough to see her family heal and reform into something new and beautiful. Later that evening, after the custody papers were signed and the children were tired from playing, they all sat on the terrace watching the sunset. Sophie was dozing in Alexander's lap. Thomas was explaining constellations to anyone who would listen, and Charlotte was choreographing one last dragon dance. "Do you ever wonder," Alexander asked quietly, "what would have happened if I hadn't gone out for milk that day?" Emma thought about it. "We'd probably be miserable," she said honestly. "You weren't ready to be a husband then, let alone a father. And I hadn't found my strength yet." He nodded, gently stroking Sophie's hair. "Sometimes the worst mistakes lead to the best outcomes, not because they were right, but because they force us to become better people." As if to punctuate his words, Thomas pointed excitedly at the sky. "Look, a shooting star!" They all looked up, watching the streak of light arc across the darkening sky. Charlotte immediately began making wishes out loud. A pet dragon, a space shuttle, a tutu made of stardust, while Sophie stirred just enough to mumble something about wishing for more dragons in London. Emma closed her eyes but made no wish. Everything she needed was already here, not in the way she'd once imagined, but in a way that was real and true and hard-won. A year ago, she'd been a single mother protecting her children from the pain of abandonment. Now she was part of something larger, an unconventional family bound together not by traditional structures, but by choice, growth, and love. "Time to head home," she said finally, as the first stars began to appear. "Which home?" Thomas asked sleepily. "Daddy's tonight," Charlotte remembered. "We're making space pancakes for breakfast." "With dragon-shaped syrup," Sophie added, suddenly more awake. As they gathered their things, Emma caught Alexander's eye. They shared a smile, not of romance or regret, but of deep understanding. They had finally found their way, not back to what was lost, but forward to something new and unexpected. Sometimes, after all, the best love stories aren't about falling in love, but about learning to love in a different way, wiser, stronger, and true enough to put children's hearts before adult pride. And sometimes the most beautiful endings aren't endings at all, but beginnings in disguise.